The frost still clung to the broken trees when Obergefreiter Klaus Hoffman crouched behind the shattered stone wall near Saint Vith. It was December 17th, 1944, and the third day of what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. Around him, the bodies of American soldiers lay scattered across the snow, some still clutching rifles, others sprawled face down where artillery had caught them. The air smelled of cordite and pine needles and something else, something he couldn't name. Death, perhaps. Or just winter in the Ardennes forest. Hoffman's hands shook as he searched the nearest American body, not from fear, though fear lived in his chest like a stone, but from hunger. His unit had been advancing for 72 hours, with nothing but half a loaf of dark bread and a tin of fatty meat paste each man was supposed to make last 3 days. The Eiserne Portion, the iron ration, they called it. 1 300-gram can of Schmalzfleisch and 120, 5 grams of hard bread, emergency food, survival food, nothing more. He found the dead soldier's pack half buried in the snow and pulled it open, expecting to find maybe a letter, maybe a photograph, maybe nothing at all worth taking. Instead, his fingers touched cardboard. Waxed cardboard. 3 small boxes, each no bigger than a brick, stacked neatly inside. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He pulled one out and turned it over in his grimy hands. The box was brown with black lettering stamped across the top. Breakfast unit. Below that, more words in English he could barely read. 1 complete meal, 1 meal, in a box this small. He almost laughed. Some kind of American joke, surely. Behind him, Gefreiter Otto Becker crawled over, breathing hard. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Hoffman held up the box. "Food, I think," he said. Becker squinted at it. That's smaller than our soup ration. Maybe it's empty. Maybe it's propaganda." Hoffman shook the box gently. Something shifted inside. It wasn't empty. He tore open the waterproofed outer layer, then peeled away the inner waxed cardboard. The smell hit him immediately. Real food, actual food. Not rotten, not stale, fresh. Inside the box, packed with almost surgical precision, lay a universe of plenty. A small tin can, painted olive green with a twist key attached. Biscuits wrapped in waxed paper. A paper packet of instant coffee. Sugar cubes, chewing gum. A tiny tin of fruit jam. 4 cigarettes in a sealed pack. Matches. A wooden spoon. And at the bottom, a single square of toilet paper, folded neatly. Hoffman stared. He couldn't speak. He held up the tin can. "Otto," he whispered, "this is just breakfast. Just 1 meal." Becker leaned closer, his eyes widening. "What's in the can?" Hoffman used the twist key, winding the metal strip around the rim until the lid popped free. Inside, chunks of ham and scrambled eggs sat in a thick layer of golden grease. The steam rose into the frozen air, carrying with it the scent of salt and meat, and something impossibly rich. Becker's mouth fell open. "They give this to every soldier?" Hoffman nodded slowly, still unable to believe what he was seeing. "Every day. 3 meals, 3 boxes." He reached into the dead American's pack again and pulled out 2 more. Dinner unit, supper unit. For a long moment, neither man moved. Around them, the battle raged. Machine gun fire chattered in the distance. Artillery thumped against the frozen ground. But here, in this small pocket of silence, 2 German soldiers knelt in the snow and stared at 3 cardboard boxes that weighed less than 2 kilograms together, but contained more food than their entire squad received in a week. Maybe more. They didn't know yet. They were about to find out. Hoffman had been a soldier for 3 years. He'd fought in France, in Russia, and now in Belgium. He knew hunger the way other men knew their wives. Intimately. Constantly. The Wehrmacht ration scale was precise, scientifically calculated to provide 3,600 calories per day in garrison, 4,500 in combat. On paper, it looked generous. 750 grams of bread, 150 grams of fat, divided between butter and lard, 120 grams of meat, a kilogram of potatoes, coffee, sugar, vegetables, when available. But paper wasn't reality. Reality was supply lines stretched across 1,000 kilometers of broken roads and bombed railways. Reality was field kitchens that arrived hours late or not at all. Reality was the Eiserne Portion, the emergency iron ration every soldier carried. 1 can of meat and 1 brick of hard bread, forbidden to open unless ordered. Reality was eating once a day, if lucky, cold soup and black bread if the goulash cannoni, the goulash cannon, could reach the front. Reality was watching men collapse, not from wounds but from exhaustion born of starvation. Hoffman opened the dinner unit next. Another small tin, this one labelled cheese. He pried it open. Inside sat a processed cheese loaf, bright yellow, soft as butter. Beside it in the box were more biscuits, different from the breakfast ones. Crackers, maybe, hard but not stone-hard like German Hartskeks. There were caramels wrapped in cellophane, a packet of lemon powder, more sugar, more cigarettes, more matches, and a second toilet paper square. He laughed then, a dry sound without humour. They even give them paper to wipe their asses, he muttered. We use leaves. Becca was already eating. He'd torn into the ham and eggs from the breakfast tin, scooping the greasy meat into his mouth with the little wooden spoon. His eyes were closed. Tears ran down his dirty cheeks, cutting lines through the grime. Hoffman watched him for a moment, then opened the supper unit. Meatloaf, a chocolate bar, bouillon powder, another set of biscuits, more coffee, more everything. He sat back against the frozen wall and did the math in his head. Each box, maybe 900 calories. 3 boxes, 2,700 calories minimum. Maybe more if you counted the sugar, the chocolate, the fat in the cheese and meat. And every American soldier carried this. Every single day. His own ration, when it arrived, when the supply trucks made it through, when the quartermaster hadn't run out, came to maybe 1,500 calories in the field. Often less. A half loaf of bread, a spoonful of margarine, a thin slice of sausage, cold soup if there was time to heat water. Once a week, maybe, 3 eggs. Twice a week, a cup of milk. The rest was potatoes, endless potatoes, boiled until they fell apart, served with nothing but salt. That was combat rations for the Wehrmacht. That was what fueled the army of the Third Reich. But this was abundance. This was wealth. This was an industrial nation feeding its soldiers as if food was infinite, as if calories were cheap, as if every man who wore the uniform deserved not just to survive but to thrive. Hoffman bit into one of the biscuits. It was hard, but not unpleasant, slightly sweet, dense with grain. He chewed slowly, making it last, and thought about the propaganda he'd been fed for years. America was weak, they'd been told. America was starving, they'd been told. America was a nation divided, its people desperate, its cities burning, its economy collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and chaos. Lies. All of it lies. A nation that could package this much food for one soldier for one day wasn't starving. A nation that included chocolate and cigarettes and toilet paper in combat rations wasn't collapsing. A nation that made sure its men ate nearly 3,000 calories even in the middle of a forest battle wasn't weak. This was power. Real power. Not tanks, not planes, not bombs. This. Food. Logistics. The ability to feed an army so well that every soldier carried what an entire German squad might see in 7 days. Otto finished the ham and eggs and started on the cheese. How do they do it? He asked quietly. How do they make this much food? Hoffman shook his head. I don't know. Factories. Maybe. Big factories that never stop. Becker wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. We can't win, he said. The words hung in the cold air between them. Hoffman wanted to argue, wanted to say something about discipline or courage or the will to fight. But he couldn't, because Becker was right. An army that ate like this, that never went hungry, that carried abundance in its pockets, couldn't be beaten by men who fought on empty stomachs. They stayed there for another hour, eating slowly, rationing the food even though there was more than enough. Old habits died hard. Around them, other soldiers from their unit began to appear, creeping through the snow, searching the dead. Hoffman watched as each man found the same thing he had: the K rations. The small cardboard boxes, the impossible plenty. He watched their faces change, first disbelief, then confusion, then something darker, understanding. One soldier, a young recruit named Franz, who couldn't have been older than 18, sat down hard in the snow and wept. "They told us America was finished," he said, his voice breaking. "They told us we were winning." Another soldier, a veteran sergeant named Wilhelm, opened a tin of meatloaf and stared at it for a long time before speaking. "We're not fighting men," he said quietly. "We're fighting a machine that doesn't get tired, doesn't go hungry, doesn't run out." By nightfall, half the company had eaten American rations, the other half was dead. The survivors gathered in a ruined farmhouse, huddled around a small fire that barely cut the cold. Someone had found an entire case of K rations in an abandoned American supply truck. 36 meals. Enough to feed 12 men for 3 days, or 36 men for 1 day. They divided them carefully, each man taking one complete ration. No one argued, no one fought. There was too much. The wooden crate itself told a story. Stamped on the side in black letters was the manufacturer's information: Wrigley Company, Chicago; Heinz Company, Pittsburgh; Kraft Foods, Wisconsin. Names of places Hoffman had never heard of, cities that apparently had enough food to send entire factories worth overseas. The date stamp read October 1944, 2 months old. These rations had been made, shipped across the Atlantic, transported through France, moved up to the front lines, and distributed to American soldiers, all in the time it took German supply convoys to move food from Bavaria to Belgium. Wilhelm, the veteran sergeant, ran his finger along the crate's edge. "Look at this," he said quietly. "It's stamped with inspection numbers, quality control marks. Someone in a factory in America checked this crate to make sure it met standards." He laughed, but the sound was bitter. "Our goulash cannoni serves soup with maggots, and no one says anything. Their factories reject food that isn't perfect." Another soldier, a former economics student from Heidelberg named Johann, examined the packaging more closely. Each K ration box had printing on all sides: nutritional information, preparation instructions in simple English designed for men who might be barely literate, expiration dates, storage guidelines. "The level of organization," he said softly, "is extraordinary. They've industrialized field feeding, mass production applied to individual meals." He shook his head. "We can't compete with this. We were never competing with soldiers. We were competing with assembly lines." Franz, the young recruit, held up one of the cigarette packs from his ration. 4 cigarettes, American brands he'd seen in pre-war magazines. Lucky Strike, Camel. Before the war, his father had smoked American cigarettes, paying premium prices for imported tobacco. Now the enemy was giving them away to every soldier, every day, as if tobacco was abundant enough to be disposable. He thought about his father's last letter, mentioning that the tobacco ration in Germany had been cut again. 1 cigar per week now, if you were lucky, sometimes just cigarette papers and a promise. "How many soldiers do they have?" Franz asked suddenly. The sergeant looked up. "The Americans? Maybe 1 million in Europe by now. More coming every month." Franz did the math in his head, his voice rising slightly. 1 million soldiers, each getting 3 meals a day. That's 3 million meals. Every day. The number was incomprehensible. 3 million individual rations, each packaged, shipped, distributed, every single day. Where do they get the food? Where do they get the boxes? The paper? The cans? Johann answered, his voice hollow. From an economy that never stopped, from farms that still have workers, from factories that weren't bombed, from railways that run on schedule, from a country that's growing richer while we grow poorer. He pulled out a chocolate bar from his supper unit and stared at it. This chocolate probably travelled 5,000 kilometres to get here. It crossed an ocean, it rode on trucks through France, and it still arrived fresh, wrapped in paper, ready to eat. Our chocolate ration was cancelled 8 months ago. The cocoa goes to U-boat crews now. If there are U-boats left. Hoffman lay on the floor that night, his stomach full for the first time in weeks, and thought about home. His mother in Dresden, standing in line for bread. His sister in Munich, trading jewellery for eggs. His father, dead now, killed in an air raid that reduced their neighbourhood to rubble. They were starving. He knew that. The letters that made it through the censors said nothing, but the spaces between the words spoke volumes. Germany was eating itself from the inside. Every calorie sent to the front was a calorie stolen from the cities. Every kilogram of potatoes packed for the army was a kilogram that didn't reach the bread lines. But it was worse than that. The letters that did arrive, smuggled through neutral countries or passed along by prisoners, released for medical reasons, painted a picture of systematic starvation. His mother's last letter, written in October, mentioned waiting 4 hours for half a loaf of bread. She'd lost 15 kilograms since the previous winter. His sister wrote that milk was only available for children under 6 years old, and even then, just 1 cup per day. The butter ration had been reduced to 125 grams per week. Meat came once every 2 weeks, if the supply held. Potatoes were the only constant, and even those were often rotten. In Berlin, he'd heard, people were keeping rabbits in their apartments, raising them on scraps and kitchen waste, slaughtering them in bathtubs. In Hamburg, after the firestorms, survivors had eaten anything they could find. Cats, dogs, rats pulled from the rubble. The stories filtered back through wounded soldiers, through letters, through whispered conversations. Germany wasn't just losing the war, it was consuming itself in desperation. The cities were starving while the army at the front survived on thin soup and promises. And here, in this ruined farmhouse, German soldiers were eating American chocolate. American ham, American cheese that was softer and richer than anything they'd tasted in years. The contrast was obscene. Hoffman tried to feel guilty about it, tried to imagine his mother's hollow face and refused to eat. But his body betrayed him, his stomach demanded food, his hands reached for the biscuits, his mouth watered at the thought of the meatloaf still waiting in his pack. Survival overrode morality. It always did. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the broken walls. Wilhelm spoke again, his voice distant. "I was in Russia," he said. "Winter of 41. We were outside Moscow, freezing, no winter uniforms because someone in Berlin said the war would be over before Christmas. Our rations came once every 3 days if we were lucky. We ate horse meat. We boiled leather belts for the calories. Men died of exposure because they were too weak from hunger to march." He paused, staring into the flames. And the Russians? They were starving too. Everyone was starving. That's what war is. Hunger and cold and death. But this? He gestured at the empty K ration boxes piled in the corner. This isn't war. This is something else. This is an industrial power projecting force through abundance. The Americans aren't just fighting us. They're proving they don't have to sacrifice to do it. Their soldiers eat better in combat than our civilians eat at home. That's not tactics. That's not courage. That's economic supremacy. Johann nodded slowly. "I studied economics before I was conscripted," he said. "I read about American industrial output." Everyone laughed. American cars, American gadgets, American waste. We thought it made them soft. We thought discipline would beat decadence. He laughed bitterly. But we misunderstood what we were seeing. They weren't soft. They were efficient. Mass production isn't weakness, it's strength. The ability to make so much that you can afford to give away the surplus. That's power we never had. Think about it, he continued, warming to his subject despite the cold. Each K ration probably costs them what? $1? Maybe less with mass production. They're feeding 1 million soldiers 3 times a day for maybe $3 million. And they can afford it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Their economy generates enough wealth that feeding an army is just a line item, an expense they don't even think about. Meanwhile, we've rationed everything: bread, meat, milk, coal, soap, everything, because we don't have enough. We never had enough. We started this war thinking willpower would overcome mathematics. We were wrong. Franz was crying quietly in the corner, his arms wrapped around his knees. I volunteered, he whispered. I believed. I thought we were saving Europe, building something great. My teachers said America was weak, divided, corrupted by Jews and Negroes and immigrants. They said German strength would prevail. He looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. But they lied. They lied about everything. These soldiers we're fighting? They're not weak. They're not desperate. They're winning because they have this. He held up an empty K ration box. They're winning because someone in a factory in Chicago made 1,000 boxes like this today. And we'll make 1,000 more tomorrow. How do we fight that? No one answered. Because there was no answer. You couldn't fight an assembly line with courage. You couldn't defeat a factory with faith. You couldn't starve out an enemy that dropped food from airplanes like rain. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. One side had built an economy of abundance. The other had built an economy of sacrifice. And sacrifice, no matter how noble, couldn't defeat plenty. The conversation drifted into silence. Men ate slowly, savouring flavours they'd forgotten existed. The instant coffee, when mixed with hot water from melted snow, tasted bitter and strong and impossibly good. The sugar dissolved on their tongues like luxury. The chocolate, rationed carefully, 1 square at a time, melted into a richness that brought back memories of peacetime, of childhood, of a world before hunger became the constant companion. Hoffman found himself studying the packaging again. Every detail spoke of thought, planning, intention. The waxed cardboard was waterproof. The inner boxes were colour-coded. Brown for breakfast, blue for dinner, olive for supper. Each component was wrapped individually. The cigarettes were in protective cellophane. The matches were waterproofed. Even the wooden spoon had been sanded smooth to prevent splinters. Someone, somewhere, had designed this system with care, had thought about what a soldier needed not just to survive but to maintain morale. Comfort items, tobacco, candy, toilet paper, small dignities that said, "You matter, your well-being matters." German rations, when they existed, came in bulk. Large tins of meat shared among squads, bread distributed in loaves to be divided. Communal suffering, communal meals, communal survival. The individual didn't matter, the unit did. The Reich did. Personal comfort was weakness. Personal need was selfishness. You ate what you were given and grateful for it. If you starved for the cause. If you survived to fight again. That was the philosophy. That was the system. And it was failing. Because men, in the end, are individuals. They have individual stomachs that demand filling, individual bodies that weaken without food, individual minds that break under the weight of constant hunger. The American system acknowledged this, fed it, sustained it. Each soldier received his own rations, his own meals, his own chocolate and cigarettes and coffee. He didn't have to share. He didn't have to fight his comrades for scraps. He didn't have to watch while officers ate better food in warm quarters. Everyone got the same. Private or general, if you were in the field, you got K rations. Democracy applied to calories. The psychological impact of that was staggering. Hoffman had seen it in the American prisoners they'd captured earlier in the offensive. Young men, barely old enough to shave, who'd surrendered not out of cowardice, but out of surprise at being surrounded. And even in captivity, even as prisoners, they'd seemed almost confident. Just secure in the knowledge that their side would win, their army would advance, their country would prevail, because they'd been fed well. Because they'd never known the gnawing, desperate hunger that hollowed you out from the inside. Because they believed in a system that worked. Wilhelm stood and stretched, his joints cracking. "Get some sleep," he said quietly. "Tomorrow we march east. The offensive is stalling. High Command will want us to regroup." Men settled into uncomfortable positions on the cold floor, wrapping themselves in whatever blankets or coats they could find. The fire died to embers. Outside, the winter night pressed close, dark and infinite and cold. But Hoffman couldn't sleep. His mind raced with calculations, comparisons, realizations. He thought about the Ardennes offensive itself, Hitler's last gamble, they called it. A surprise attack meant to split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, sue for peace, bold, daring, desperate, and already failing because of one simple fact: fuel. The panzers had rolled forward on captured gasoline, planning to seize American fuel dumps along the way. But the Americans had better intelligence, better mobility, better supply lines. They'd moved their fuel, protected their depots, left the German tanks stranded, out of gas, unable to advance or retreat, just sitting targets for American artillery. Logistics again. Always logistics. The Germans had planned an offensive based on scavenging enemy supplies. The Americans simply had enough supplies that losing a few depots didn't matter. They brought more, shipped it across the Atlantic, trucked it through France, distributed it with mechanical efficiency. Oil, ammunition, food, medical supplies. Everything an army needed, delivered on schedule, in quantity, without fail. Hoffman thought about the letters from his mother, about her mentioning that the trams in Dresden had stopped running because there was no coal. No coal, in Germany, a country built on coal and steel. The war had consumed everything, drained every resource, stripped every railway car, every factory, every mine of its output, and funneled it toward the front. And still, it wasn't enough. Still the armies went hungry. Still the civilians froze. Still the cities crumbled under Allied bombs because there weren't enough fighter planes, weren't enough anti-aircraft guns, weren't enough men to operate them even if they existed. Meanwhile, America was making rations with chocolate included, with cigarettes included, with toilet paper included. The disparity was so vast it seemed impossible. Like different worlds existing simultaneously, one world of scarcity and sacrifice and slow starvation, another world of assembly lines and abundance and casual waste. And these two worlds were colliding here, in the Ardennes forest, in the snow, in the ruins of farmhouses and villages, and there was no doubt which world would prevail. But America? America fed its soldiers chocolate. America gave them cigarettes and coffee and jam. America made sure every man carried toilet paper. What kind of nation could afford that? What kind of economy produced such abundance that it could be packaged in cardboard boxes and dropped from planes and scattered across battlefields like leaves in autumn? The answer was obvious. The answer had been obvious for a long time, if anyone had been willing to see it. America wasn't starving. America had never been starving. America was a giant that had been sleeping, and now it was awake, and it was feeding its children better than Germany had ever fed its own. The next morning, they moved out. Hoffman carried 2K rations in his pack, saved for later, and left his iron ration untouched. Why eat hard bread and fatty paste when you could have ham and eggs? Why choke down compressed pea soup pellets when you could have meat, loaf, and chocolate? The logic was inescapable. Around him, other soldiers did the same. They scavenged American rations wherever they could find them, from the dead, from abandoned positions, from shelled supply trucks. It became a kind of currency, a kind of wealth. A man with rations was a man to be envied, but it also became something else, a kind of proof. Evidence that everything they'd been told, everything they'd believed, everything they'd fought for, was built on sand. The Reich had promised them victory. The Reich had promised them a new Europe. The Reich had promised them that sacrifice now would mean glory later, but the Reich couldn't even promise them a full stomach. Meanwhile, the enemy, the supposed weaklings, the divided and desperate Americans, were eating like kings. The psychological weight of it crushed morale faster than any artillery barrage. Hoffman saw it in the eyes of the men around him. The doubt, the exhaustion, the slow realization that they were on the wrong side of history. Not because of ideology or politics, or even morality, but because of simple, brutal arithmetic. The side that could feed its soldiers would win. The side that couldn't would starve. And they were starving. On December 22nd, the weather cleared and the American planes returned. Hoffman watched from a foxhole as transport aircraft flew low over the German lines, dropping crates. Not bombs, crates. Supply crates. He saw them hit the ground and burst open, scattering their contents across the snow. More K rations. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Enough to feed an army. And they were just dropping them. Just throwing them away. Because they had so many. He turned to Otto, who sat beside him in the foxhole, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The message was clear. America could afford to lose more food in a single supply drop than the Wehrmacht could deliver to an entire division in a week. The mathematics of war had spoken. The verdict was in. They'd lost. Not today, not this week, maybe not even this month. But they'd lost. Because you couldn't fight logistics with courage. You couldn't fight abundance with willpower. You couldn't fight a nation that packaged 3 meals a day in cardboard boxes and dropped them from the sky. By Christmas, the offensive had stalled. By January, it had failed. Hoffman survived, though many didn't. He was captured in February, near Cologne, processed through a POW camp, and eventually sent to England to work on a farm. In the camp, they were fed American rations, C rations now, not K rations, heavier cans, more variety, ham and lima beans, chicken and vegetables, pork and rice, 3 cans per man per day, plus bread, plus coffee, plus whatever else the supply sergeants could scrounge. He ate until his stomach hurt, until he couldn't remember what hunger felt like, until the hollows in his cheeks filled out and his ribs stopped showing through his shirt. Around him, other prisoners did the same. They gained weight, they grew stronger. They stopped looking like ghosts and started looking like men again. And they talked, late at night in the barracks, about the rations. Always the rations. The impossible plenty. The casual abundance. The sheer overwhelming proof that they'd been fighting something they could never defeat. One night, an older prisoner, a captain who'd fought in North Africa and Russia and France, stood up and said what they were all thinking. They didn't beat us with bullets, he said quietly. They beat us with food. They beat us with factories and farms and trains that ran on time. They beat us with a system that could put a chocolate bar in every soldier's pocket. We never had a chance. Not really. Because you can't fight that. You can't will your way past logistics. You can't hate your way past mathematics. Hoffman thought about those words often in the years that followed. After the war, after repatriation, after returning to a Germany that no longer existed. Dresden was gone, burned to ash. Munich was rubble. Berlin was divided. Everything he'd known, everything he'd fought for, everything he'd believed, had been reduced to memory and smoke. But he remembered the K rations. He remembered opening that first small cardboard box in the snow and realizing that the war was already over, that it had maybe been over before it started. Because the side that fed its soldiers ham and eggs for breakfast was always going to beat the side that fed them hard bread and hope. He worked for years in a factory in Frankfurt, making machinery parts, rebuilding what the war had destroyed. He married, had children, tried to forget. But, sometimes, late at night, he'd tell his son about the rations, about the moment he understood, about the cardboard boxes that weighed less than 2 kilograms but contained the truth about power and nations and the mathematics of survival. His son would listen, eyes wide, unable to quite believe. But Hoffman knew. He'd seen it. He'd tasted it. He'd carried it in his pack. The German iron ration had been designed for survival. 1 can of meat. 1 brick of bread. Enough to keep a man alive for 24 hours in an emergency. The American K ration had been designed for combat. 3 meals, 2,800 calories. Enough to keep a man fighting, thinking, strong. That difference, that gap between survival and thriving, between just enough and more than enough, was the difference between winning and losing. It was the difference between a nation that could afford to drop food from planes and a nation that couldn't feed its own cities. It was the difference between America and the plains, Reich, and Hoffman had learned it not from strategy or tactics or grand speeches about destiny. He'd learned it from a cardboard box found in the snow, from ham and eggs that steamed in the frozen air, from chocolate bars and cigarettes and squares of toilet paper folded with care, from the simple, brutal, undeniable fact that the enemy had so much food they packaged it in individual portions and gave it away like water. That was power, real power, the kind that won wars. Years later, in the 1960s, Hoffman's grandson asked him what the war had been like. The boy was young, too young to remember rationing, too young to understand hunger. Hoffman thought for a long time before answering. "It was cold," he said finally, "and we were always hungry. Until we weren't." The boy frowned, confused. "What changed?" Hoffman smiled, though there was no joy in it. "We found out what the other side was eating, and after that, we knew we'd lost. The mathematics had been simple. One German, the soldier's weekly ration, when supply lines held and the field kitchen arrived and nothing went wrong, came to maybe 10,500 calories spread across 7 days, 1,500 per day. Survival level. Barely enough to march and fight and sleep. One American soldier's daily K ration, just the 3 small boxes meant for field use when hot food wasn't available, provided 2,800 calories. Multiply that by a week, and you got 19,600 calories, nearly double. And that wasn't counting the hot meals they got when they weren't in combat, the A rations with fresh food, the B rations with canned goods, the endless supply drops that kept them fed even when surrounded. The disparity was staggering. It was insurmountable. It was proof written in calories and grams and ounces that one side had built a machine for winning, while the other side was barely keeping its soldiers alive. And once you saw that, once you understood what it meant, you couldn't unsee it. You couldn't pretend anymore. You couldn't tell yourself that discipline would overcome hunger, that willpower would beat logistics, that faith would substitute for food. Because it wouldn't. It never had. It never would. Hoffman died in 1978, an old man in a rebuilt country that had learned its lessons and moved on. His funeral was small, attended by family and a few old friends who'd also survived. One of them, Otto Becker, now grey and bent, stood by the grave and said something Hoffman would have appreciated. "We fought for years," Otto said quietly. "But we lost in a day. The day we opened those boxes and saw what real power looked like. The day we understood that war isn't won by soldiers. It's won by the people who feed them." The story of Klaus Hoffman and the K ration wasn't unique. Thousands of German soldiers had the same experience. Tens of thousands, maybe more. They captured American positions and found abundance. They searched American, dead and discovered wealth. They surrendered and ate better as prisoners than they ever had as soldiers. And each time, the same realization hit like a hammer. We were lied to. We were told the enemy was weak. We were told America was starving, divided, finished. But America wasn't starving. America was packaging chocolate bars for its troops. America was dropping food from planes. America was winning because it had built a system that could produce so much that it could afford to waste it. That was the real shock. Not that American soldiers ate well, but that they ate so well the surplus could be scattered across battlefields like propaganda leaflets, that a nation could be so rich in food that individual servings came in waterproof boxes with cigarettes and matches and toilet paper included. That logistics, the boring science of supply and transport and production, had become a weapon more devastating than any bomb. The Germans had prided themselves on precision engineering, on tactical brilliance, on the fighting spirit of their troops. Simply feed its soldiers until they were strong enough to keep coming, wave after wave, supplied by a machine that never stopped, never tired, never ran out. The K ration, in the end, was more than just food. It was a message. A declaration written in ham and eggs and chocolate bars that said, "We have so much we can afford to give this to every man. What do you have?" And the answer, written in the hollow eyes of German soldiers who fought on black bread and hope, was, "Not enough. Never enough. We thought courage would be sufficient. We thought discipline would compensate. We thought belief would bridge the gap, but it didn't. Because war, in the end, is arithmetic. Calories times soldiers times days equals victory or defeat, and the side with more calories wins." That lesson, learned in the snow near Saint Vith in December of 1944, became the lesson of the war itself. The side that could feed its people, arm its soldiers, supply its armies, and still have enough left over to package individual meals in cardboard boxes was the side that would prevail. Not because its soldiers were braver or smarter or more dedicated, but because its system worked, because its factories ran, because its trains arrived on time, because it understood that war wasn't just about killing the enemy, it was about sustaining your own. And America sustained its soldiers better than any army in history. Klaus Hoffman learned that lesson from 3 small boxes found in a dead man's pack. He carried it with him for the rest of his life. Not as shame, though there was shame. Not as regret, though there was regret, but as understanding, as knowledge, as proof that sometimes the truth comes not from speeches or strategy, but from simple observation, from seeing what the other side eats and realizing what that means, from understanding that power isn't just tanks and planes, it's also ham and eggs at breakfast, it's also chocolate for dessert, it's also toilet paper folded neatly at the bottom of a cardboard box, because even that, even the smallest comfort, mattered to the nation that knew how to win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.